welcome to another episode of the Living Pianos podcast with your host,
Robert Estrin.
Me, Mike Wood, and our special guest today,
Bijan Taghavi.
Now, Bijan and Robert, you guys have quite a bit of history.
We go back a long way. How
back.
many years was it? Oh, my God. All I know is you were a little kid.
When maybe 2009?
Something like that. Or maybe, might be longer ago than that. For all of you out there who are wondering what we're talking about here, Bijan studied piano with me from the time he was a young child. He had studied for about a year before that formally, or I don't know, you started when you were ungodly young, right?
Well, I started when I was 3.5, and I was inspired by Elton John, actually, but I studied formally, I guess, at the Yamaha School of Music, where after 4 years I graduated. Then you took me under your wing, so I guess that's when I was 7 or 8 then. So
there we go.
That must be earlier, 2006.
And just a flash forward so everybody knows what this show is going to be about a little bit. Bijan is now at the Manhattan School of Music on scholarship in jazz studies. And when he last left here, he was delving into jazz in a big way, had been playing concertos with symphony orchestras, winning competitions, and then he went to the dark side. No, just kidding about that. Actually, very cool stuff that Bijan is up to. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mike to give us some direction here.
So I have a few questions here for our guest. What was it about piano? Was it something particularly that made you want to study that instrument over anything else?
You mean when I first?
Yeah.
Well, it was just Elton John and his whole persona and showmanship, just the way he turned the piano into a vehicle of expression that I guess inspired me at a young age.
So for years you'd studied classical music with Bob, and then you transitioned into jazz.
Right. So that was right after I actually played the Grieg Concerto with the South Coast Symphony Orchestra, so I guess that was the summer of my sophomore year before my junior year in high school. Yeah, then I remember it was a Prodigy concert at our friend Dan Delaney's. He had a Prodigy series, and I remember he always mentioned his piano is great for jazz, quote unquote. I thought, I was crazy, and I thought I'd try some jazz. We did that, and then from then on, with also the guidance, of course, of yourself, Robert, and my guitar instructor, also Brett Eklund, as well as a prior engagement I had done with a Grammy artist, Latin jazz flutist Nestor Torres, a couple months before that. The culmination of those things kind of got me into jazz, and then from then on I kind of took off, and now I'm studying jazz.
Interesting thing, though, about you that was very different from other students was that you would come into lessons and you would cop blues that you heard and rock and all different styles, and I saw that you had a real affinity for this, which is why I encouraged you. And I remember early on telling you, you should really pursue jazz. You should get into jazz. And you said, oh, I already know jazz.
Yeah, I was a little over the top with that.
You didn't really know what jazz was, because you did some blues. So you thought, oh, yeah, I got that jazz thing down. And I said, well, no, there's a lot more to it. And because, okay, going back, I'll tell you the pivotal moment that I knew something was up. With all my students early on, I teach not only how to memorize music and how to sight read music, but how to improvise music. And one of the ways I do this, the very, very beginning, I will just do some very, very simple comping with very young students. Maybe I'll just play something with black keys and let them play a solo with just black keys, because it's hard to hit a wrong one. And then have them comp and I solo. And you were a little bit more sophisticated, so I had you just play a D minor chord to a G major chord, just playing the D in the left hand and the two top notes of the chord in the right hand to comp, and I did some fancy solos on top of it. And then we reversed, and I did the comping, and you did some creative solos, which is not highly unusual. But then I said, okay, now the hard part, and this is where usually everything falls apart. I said, now I just want you to play in the left hand this D minor chord and the G major chord, just in the inversion, so it's a simple, but the hardest part is keeping it steady. And I said, do anything in your right hand, but make sure the left hand doesn't lose or gain time. And right from the very beginning, you were able to do it. every other student I've ever given that to completely loses the left hand rhythm as soon as they try to solo with any kind of fluidity in the right hand at all, even like whole notes. And you just instantly could do it. I thought, oh my God. And the other thing that you were really good at was creating a groove. At a very young age, you would really get these nice syncopated grooves that I found very compelling, even when you were a young child. So that's why I always encouraged you. But of course, your primary study with me was classical music. You got achieved quite a bit. And so here we are today.
Well, that subject of a groove, I'm sure we'll get into it later, but that's something actually Justin DeChocho, our jazz chair at the Manhattan School of Music, impresses on us a lot. He always tells us in his raspy voice, he's like, life is about a groove. Everything's about a groove. Create a groove. So, we always try to get that. And again, we'll probably get into this later, but with jazz, there's no real mistakes, quote unquote. But the one thing you do have to do is keep the time steady and keep the rhythm grooving, because otherwise if the groove is off, then the audience will notice something. But if you keep the groove on and you flub a couple notes here and there, nobody's gonna tell.
This transcends jazz. Of course, with classical, there may be some people out there who know every note of the score, but 98% of the audience, if you just keep the rhythm going, will not notice if you have a memory slip or some unfortunate occurrence.
Right.
It's so important to keep things going. So that's a universal thought.
Well, as far as classical versus jazz, what are the major hurdles you encountered when switching from classical to jazz?
Well, I guess to start with, I'll kind of on an opposite note. Something that definitely helped a lot was having the classical foundation. Just musically and technically, having that base was, I can't imagine going ahead with jazz without that. But as far as the hurdles you said, I guess it varies depending on the person. One, because I was already kind of into the whole rock, pop, blues kind of thing.
And plus with your guitar studies and also playing bass, I mean, obviously on guitar you weren't playing classical. Well, not obviously, but you weren't.
There we go. But I mean, it was easier for me because of that to kind of let go and kind of experiment. But the hardest thing is probably that for most is just being able to let go and just improvise, because with classical music everything is there for you. Yeah, so I'd say that's probably the biggest thing. There are a bunch of other things that are not coming to mind right now, but
now, was it difficult for you at first to start improvising, or did it start to come naturally? Because I can imagine if you're playing a style of music for a long time that doesn't have any improvisation in it, naturally, classical music, going to something that's very, very heavy in improvisation, I can imagine could be a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a challenge. And then also not having any sort of jazz vocabulary, quote unquote, no bebop language, no...
The first thing that you had to develop was an expanded harmonic vocabulary.
Right.
Because early on you were doing very simple triadic and maybe seventh chords, and that was about it.
Right.
And then once you started adding those augmented ninths and 13ths, that was the beginning of adding spice to your music.
Another difficult thing, for me at least, I'll say about switching from classical to jazz, was coming from prodigy, top of the world, doing all monumental things in the classical world, playing with symphony orchestras, playing works of Rachmaninoff and Beethoven sonatas, etc.
Accompanying Metropolitan Opera singers.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, all kinds of pretty impressive stuff.
So, coming from the top of the classical world and then suddenly being able to let go of the ego and start at the bottom again, that was probably the roughest thing at first, especially when, and I was playing a lot of concerts. We did living piano together. So, always having that kind of positive feedback. And then suddenly I could use more obscene language, but just god awful with jazz to begin with. That was definitely it took a lot of, self-strength, I guess, to persevere and go through the beginnings again and go through the struggles to get back to a respectable level, I guess.